Hey, so I'm back. Yes, we are now reading McKinnon and Fiala, looking at egoism, altruism, and the social contract. Uh, so, so one thing that we need to get clear right off the top is the difference and dissonance of descriptive and prescriptive way of understanding. Okay, so a prescriptive way of understanding is therefore ethical, and so that is normative, and that also has the corollary with ethical egoism. So in other words, the term ethical egoism is normative because an ethical egoist would therefore believe that one ought to be an ethical egoist. Okay, so distinguish that also from what is normative, because what is normative likewise is just having to do with what ought to be the case. Okay, so in other words, what is normative isn't always having to do with ethical egoism, because what is normative is what we're going to be looking at for a good part of the semester in terms of our ethical theories. So our ethical theories are normative. Uh, Ethical egoism is normative, but everything that is normative is not ethical egoism. So that's the description. That's it's prescriptive, but that's the distinction that we need to make. Okay, so yes, and so that's also in connection to David Hume, because with David Hume we have what is thought of as the is-ought distinction. And so the is-ought distinction is taking us to a disconnect as far as the difference between what is the case and likewise what ought to be the case. And so what is the case is something that is not always in connection to what ought to be the case. And so, in other words, what is normative is not always something that has a clear connection to what is descriptive. And so one thing that's important there is that, for example, we could have a psychological study that reveals data points on how it is that people are selfish, for example. But those data points are not always a description. They are not always a prescription, okay? So that prescription is the normative way that we're understanding ethical egoism, and likewise, normative ethics is how it is that we're going to understand what ought to be the case, okay, for the good part of the semester, okay? So we have that distinction, and that's going to be a key part of how it is that we look at a lot of our ethical understanding, because that distinction must be clear in our head. That relationship and likewise distinction. Okay, so yes. So what's the difference then? What does that say about ethical egoism? Well, ethical egoism then is the normative position that we ought to be selfish, or that we ought to have our own self-interest in mind. Okay. And note too that there's a difference between that. So you have individual egoism, and then you also have universal egoism. And so universal egoism is everyone ought to have one self-interest in mind, whereas individual egoism is I ought to have my own self-interest in mind. So there's a difference between the two. Okay, but likewise, what does that mean in a normative sense is that we are often thinking that this is a prescription for how we ought to act, okay? Or how we ought to practice in the world. So egoism is a meta-ethical way of understanding. It's not necessarily an ethical theory, okay? So we're going to be looking at ethical theories pretty soon, but this isn't necessarily the same as an ethical theory, because it's just laying down a grounding for how it is that we're thinking of the difference between the two, normative and descriptive, okay? And likewise, selfishness versus altruism, okay? So then what is the problem for altruism in terms of an ethical egoist? the ethical egoists like Ayn Rand, who was a 20th century thinker, who was also capitalist. She's known for the philosophy objectivism. And so this is in line with capitalism, yes, and also ethical egoism, and that stands in contrast to altruism. So in other words, altruism is something where it is self-denial. So in other words, altruism is looked at where you're having others' interests before your own. And so for an ethical egoist, that's not a very good thing, because self-sacrificing in the name of someone else isn't necessarily in your best interest, right? Not only from a personal standpoint, but also as a capitalist, okay? So in other words, you're not going to let people walk all over you, perhaps, or likewise, you might not think of you might want less government control in the marketplace. So that is a neoliberal position, and so Ayn Rand is thought of as a touch-tone thinker for touch point for neoliberal position, where the position of capitalist could also be neoliberal, and that also has political ramifications and also economic ramifications as well. And then likewise, environmental considerations, right? Because if you're always having your own best interest in mind, you might just put those self-interests above and beyond the environment, right? And so there's where we have the difference between how it is that we're understanding something in terms of self-interest versus the interest of others. What are you going to place as a primary focus? The difference between egoism and altruism there is standing somewhat in contrast to a capitalist position, right? So those are some ways of thinking of Ayn Rand, and likewise a neoliberal position. If I didn't say it already, that neoliberal position also could be in terms of ideas too, right? In other words, you want less control over your ideas, less government control over the way you are acting, and there's the significance of that being related to free market, okay? So see that as being ethical, connected to ethical egoism. See it in connection to Thomas Hobbes as well. So Thomas Hobbes was a 17th century thinker who also had the idea of psychological egoism. In other words, it's a psychological egoism, likewise, is a description of how people will be. So in the absence of a social contract, in other words, in the absence of communal agreement that we should cooperate, that we need a social contract in order to cooperate, and if we don't have that social contract in place, people are what? Known as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, right? That, in other words, we will have our own self-interest in mind if we don't have that social contract in place. And this way of thinking also has its roots, it serves as the roots for a neoliberal mindset, right? And so later on, we might talk about Locke in relation to this in terms of natural law as well. I don't want to get into that right off the bat. It also has its tie-in to the founding of the United States and likewise social contract, but we'll put Locke on the back burner now. Fascinating stuff, yes. And also in terms of regulation of private property as well, right? So I think that should get us to where we need to be thinking of ethical egoism. I think that one last point I'd like to make right off the top, or in closing, would be to think of the law of unintended consequences there, and then likewise the Greek term akrasia. So akrasia is known as weakness of will, and so weakness of will stands in contrast and in contradiction to our own self-interest. So in other words, we might think that we should have our own self-interest in mind in terms of a normative standpoint. But the question is, does our will stand in our way? In other words, we have the free will to do what we want, but likewise we have weakness of the will standing in the way of our freedom of will. So in other words, weakness of will, akrasia, is something that stands in contrast to an egoist mindset, right? And so that's interesting too in terms of the law of unintended consequences, where the law of unintended consequences is that we might have our own best interest in mind, yet at the same time, unintended consequences contradict that, okay? We don't always know what will the consequences will be or the outcomes of our selfish behavior, and that will stand in contrast to our willingness to have our own best interest in mind. So think about that stuff, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.